Katherine, hello.
Hi, Christian.
Thank you very much for coming. I very much appreciate it. You're a mother of three, and I know your time has got to be in high demand with that alone.
Yes, it's tricky.
It's you're in the beaches, northern beaches.
I am on the beaches, yes.
It's a bit, it's tough for you guys to get around to Bondi, huh?
Oh, look, before kids, I was all over the city. But yeah, coming to the eastern suburbs is always a bit, the traffic and the parking and yeah.
It's hectic, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming along. And so this is a political podcast. I'm doing a series on the cultural politics, trying to find out what's happening in our society. I'm trying to learn what's going on basically and just share it with anyone that's interested.
Yep.
As you're aware, you probably know that there's a lot of people, they don't actually have the luxury to investigate or understand the going-ons, and everyone's got an opinion on these political debates. So I'm personally super interested, and I'm just wanting to know, I heard a topic, I heard you on this other podcast, which I was super happy to hear a fellow Australian talking on I call it a global political discussion going on. And so I've been looking into all this stuff for a while, keeping my finger on the pulse. And yeah, look, I was super impressed with the podcast. I thought, look, I know people on all sides of the spectrums, whichever way you want to look at them. And I know the topic that came up is transgender legislation for protection in Australia. Yeah, so I figured, look, this is a hot topic. Everyone's going on about this right now in law, I guess, all different laws of different countries all around. So yeah, I know a lot of people would love to know what I heard you speaking about as well. So I figured we need more people talking about this type of stuff. So thank you very much to come on and share.
Oh, not a problem. So there is a big debate with a lot of legislation and policy around gender identity coming into law in Australia, the states around Australia, and also other jurisdictions. So there's been huge battles fought out in the public domain.
What states, mind you, do you know, is it all states or is it somewhere?
They're working their way through the states gradually. So they've hit up like Victoria with the birth certificate legislation, where you can now go into the registry there, and they say the way it's presented is you can change your gender on your birth certificate. It's not gender, it's sex. The category is sex, but you can change your sex on your birth certificate once every 12 months. So, which is odd, because when they're debating the legislation for the conversion therapy yesterday in the Legislative Council, they were pushing the idea that gender is innate and it's something that you're born with. But then they have this other legislation that says, well, you can change it every 12 months. So there's been some legislation in Victoria, in Tasmania, and Queensland.
Okay, Kat, mind you, just so I can get another little idea about how you're involved, what have you been doing the last couple of years, and how did you get involved, like understanding or just interested in what's happening here?
So it was a few things for me. So I had daughters, and I thought, I'm going to go brush up on my feminism.
Sure.
I did women's studies at the beginning of the noughties when I was at college, and things had changed a lot since then. So I went looking and I came across liberal feminism. Now, unfortunately, liberal feminism is very pro-porn, pro-prostitution. That didn't sit comfortably with me. It seemed to be very identity focused. There seemed to be this narrative that if you're a woman and you make a choice, then it's feminist, because you're a woman making a choice. And I was like, this is kind of lacking a lot of, social structural analysis, and how can a choice that I make as an educated white woman in the 21st century with access to government paid healthcare, how's a choice that I make equivalent to a choice that an 8-year-old in Yemen is making when she's married off to a 40-year-old? There's just... So I said, this just isn't working for me. Then I came across radical feminism, which is aligned, sort of came out of second wave feminism, which is more to do with analysing the rights of women and girls as they stand currently. It's to do with ending male violence against women.
Which is like what laws back in the day, 80s, would have had the protection for women as a protected class, like discrimination against women would have been kind of by law tried to eradicate that, right?
Yeah, like we weren't allowed to get credit cards. We weren't allowed to get mortgages. We
Right.
had to quit our jobs when we got pregnant, when we got married.
Sure. Yeah.
And liberal feminism also fails to take into account what's happening to women in the global south or religious theocracies and things where women literally just do not have rights, or they have very limited rights. So here in Australia, back in 1984, we got a piece of legislation through called the Sex Discrimination Act, which was to incorporate a treaty, a UN treaty that we'd signed that's colloquially known as CEDAW. So that's Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women.
True, that's the thing I'm thinking of, right?
Yeah, so I had started on this journey of looking into feminism, and through the radical feminist analysis, I came across this whole conversation around gender identity and women's rights being undermined because there was now this push for males to be able to declare that they were female and then get access to women's spaces, scholarships, rights, obviously the toilets and change rooms conversation.
Right.
Also males competing in women's sports.
Okay, and that's where I think I saw you speaking. You're part of a group, is that right? That's trying to raise awareness about women in sports and protecting them. Is that right? Or?
Yeah, so I sort of came into this conversation and started investigating and started asking some questions online saying, well, you know, what is a T.E.R.F.? What is this transgenderism? Why is it coming into legislation? And of course, in those particular forums, when you ask those questions back then, I mean, this is 6 years ago, you would have this firestorm of like hate and abuse come down on your head.
Okay, right.
And, you know, like you're a transphobic bigot and you're this and that. And I'm sort of going, oh, hang on a second. I just asked a question. When did the rules change? Why are there boys and girls sports?
Well, that's a very contentious one alone, right? So,
yeah.
I mean, we've got differences of our physiology.
Yeah.
And so I know people would object to maybe a trans woman competing and, you know, like you've already heard cases, I'm sure, of some trans athletes outperforming and maybe breaking certain records, which is an interesting topic. So it gets back to where this is going, why this is happening, and where we should go from it. So what have you been doing in the advocacy group? Have you been?
Yeah, so I started looking into it, and then I started realising there were networks of women who were criticising this and having concerns. So I spent quite a bit of time just doing my own research. And then after a few years of doing that, in conjunction with that, I had my three little girls and I was undertaking a law degree. So I went and looked at the Australian law and I went, oh, they've already changed many of the laws here in Australia and no one knew.
Okay, so this is what I'm interested to learn. What kind of laws are we talking about?
So say with the Sex Discrimination Act at the federal level, in 2013, they put gender identity as a protected characteristic into the legislation. So you've got sex as a protected characteristic, which was originally enacted to protect women against discrimination in the public sphere.
Sure.
Now, over the decades, that has now expanded to include men who also claim sex discrimination. However, going through the AHRC, the Australian Human Rights Commission Conciliation Register, which shows all the decisions around discrimination claims, what women were complaining about compared to what men were complaining about, it was worlds apart. So So obviously the Sex Discrimination Act now extends to men, and then they put in gender identity. Now, I would argue that it's in complete conflict with sex, because for women and men, we are, you know, sex is determined at fertilisation. We are born with our sex. It is observed and recorded. It cannot change no matter what you do to your external body. You cannot change your sex. And as women, we cannot just identify out of our sex bodies. We cannot identify out of the reproductive burden that we carry within our society. But then they've put in this gender identity, and this definition comes from a paper called the Yogyakarta Principles, which was set up by a private group of individuals who have now spent considerable resources and time and effort going about the world trying to have this incorporated into human rights law. Now it's been rejected. It's been rejected by the Australian Senate. It's been rejected by the UN. And the Yogyakarta principles, unfortunately, because they actually started out really well. This was to do with protecting LGBT rights, but then gender identity jumped on board. And the definition for gender identity is very incoherent. It's to do with subjective feelings about performing stereotypes.
Right, of course. So however you may express yourself, whether you're a dominantly like feminine type character or on that whole spectrum to masculinity, that's what it's like a spectrum, right, of performance.
I mean, stereotypes are culturally relative, and the way it's worded is that even if you are thinking about your gender identity or thinking about performing these stereotypes, you'll be protected under the law. So, say for instance, with women being protected from discrimination, in order to make an equal playing field for women in the public sphere, there were certain protections that were incorporated by the Sex Discrimination Act. So we have that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we have, say, a male who claims a female identity, and then he says he's being discriminated against, and he has a valid claim. So you've sort of got maybe, let's take the example of sports. Oh, actually, no, let's not do sports. That we can talk about that separately.
Okay.
But say in relation to like there being a rape crisis centre or a domestic violence shelter that's for women only. So women can get an exemption to say this is a sex-specific service. But now we have a man who claims a gender identity that is female, and he is excluded on that basis. This is what happened with McIver, the McIver Baths debacle.
Just explain that a little bit.
But I'll finish that thought with, men can claim the gender identity, say they are a woman, and say they're being excluded on that basis, therefore it's discrimination. So we have this conflict. Which takes precedence, the sex protection or the gender identity protection? So we haven't had a case go to the High Court yet to determine which one takes precedence. But what's been happening in Australia is that the interpretations in all the institutions, the government departments, is that gender identity takes precedence over sex.
All right, so this is where I know a lot of people from both sides would love to. What I'm hoping that people hear these types of things and kind of chime in with the ideas and start talking. I think if there's laws being passed, it's going to affect how we're governed.
Yeah.
We kind of should have a say, or at least understand them, and because it's a complex situation. So.
Yeah, and then just, looking at McIver Baths, which is obviously a few minutes from here. So this is a female, like McIver Ladies Baths. So in 1922, it was officially made a ladies' baths. But prior to that, there is an Indigenous history where it was regarded as a woman's sacred space, and she would go there to give birth and to bathe.
Okay.
So it has a history going, back in time.
Okay.
Now, what happened when we had the Anti-Discrimination Act, which was enacted in 1977 in New South Wales, but they put in some transgender provisions in 1996. So what the baths did was they got an exemption where they said that they could exclude people on the basis of their sex from the facility. So that meant that they were allowed to exclude males.
Sure.
When they put in the transgender protection provisions, the way that it was working from a legal perspective in New South Wales was if someone goes and gets gender affirmation surgery, not really clear on what that means, they can go...
Gender reassignment surgery?
Well, I don't know. It's kind of it's an unknown.
Okay.
Yeah, is it facial feminization surgery? Is it a boob job? Is it the full bottom surgery?
Okay.
We don't know. That's all it says. So, and then someone goes and applies to change the sex on their birth certificate in New South Wales, and that happens. That person would have been allowed to come into the McIver Baths. So that was sort of all just working quietly.
Sure.
However, the trans rights activists, it became known to them that it wasn't on the basis of sex self-ID. So when this all blew up in the press a few weeks ago, the T.E.R.F.s were demanding that any male who shows up and says that he has a gender identity that is female, he should be granted access.
Right. So this is where it's totally just self-identification,
Yeah.
and you're legally allowed to enter like women's spaces, right?
Yeah, that they were demanding entry. So the
Okay.
types of women who are using, it's not a very big space, this McIver Baths, and there are 2 other baths within walking distance, a few steps away. The women who are using it, there's a big Jewish community in this area, big Muslim community. So there are some women who are quite strict in their faith and cannot exercise or be in bathing suits in front of males. So they will go there for their exercise. Women with small children, cancer survivors, trauma survivors.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's trumping all other types of views. Okay. So
Yep. So the women who use that, you know, there was one woman who said she was quite big-breasted and she hated going in public because she would attract the male gaze, and she felt this was the one place where she could just exercise without, you know, being objectified.
okay. So look, I know where the thoughts on that would go. Like just socially, it would be more like it's a thing about acceptance and maybe upgrading older, what you might or people may call bigoted ideas. So we grow out of these types of views and we just accept. And for a trans person, I imagine, just from reading a lot of things and listening to a lot of trans videos online of advocates for the trans liberation, etc., it's must be more about you know, acceptance and being recognised and having their identity accepted, you know, and encouraged to being able to thrive, basically. So.
But there's another, you know, that's all very well and good, but we women cannot identify out of the lived reality of our bodies. And some of these women with their faith, where are they going to go?
Yeah, exactly. So this is what I'm thinking. This stuff needs much more conversation, because I know people that would have the exact same thoughts, especially when it comes to even just like purely for a competitive part in sport. That alone is a topic. It's hard. I know a lot of avid female competitive athlete types that might be like, well, no, that unfair advantage of the testosterone through their body for X amount of years that's why it's the competition's over. So that alone is like very contentious. But then you've got the views to like biology or religious or whatever you want to call it, which is just being kind of trumped for this liberation.
For the feelings and the need to be validated for what are essentially biological males. But where McIver went really wrong was that women were saying, now hang on a second, this is a tiny, like there are hundreds of rock pools around Sydney. There is Lady Jane, which is a beach that is known to be a gay nude beach. You don't see women there trying to shut that down. This space was just a very small, sacred space for women who need to be able to exercise free from biological males. So women who then stood up and said this in the press, and there's one woman by the name of Sal Glover who has started a female-only social media platform. So she's got quite a big audience. She was speaking out in favour of keeping McIver Baths sex-specific. And we do have those protections under the law. They were there, but because of the shitstorm of hate that dumped down on the managers of the McIver pools, who are only volunteers, they acquiesce and they've opened it up to sex self-ID.
What kind of shitstorm are you talking about? Is this just
I'm
like
talking about
online?
rape. No, so Sal Glover spoke up. She received thousands of explicit rape and death threats, dismemberment threats. There was even a young gay man
online on social media.
Yeah, on social media and private messaging. There was a high-profile gay singer in this community who thought that it was okay to send her a video of himself masturbating. Really.
All right. So there's a fierce backlash. All right.
Fierce, ferocious.
So the laws are going through, and they're being debated at the moment here in Australia.
Well, the laws. So that was one little microcosm of what's going on.
Sure.
So in, say, Victoria, they've allowed people to now change their sex on their birth certificate once every 12 months. And then yesterday they pushed through some legislation that is referred to as, I think the full name is like Conversion and Suppression Practices Prohibition Bill.
Mm-hmm.
This is quite a complicated argument, but the way that it's been framed by the Labor government who's pushing it through and its supporters is that we know that gay conversion therapy used to happen in the past, and it should be condemned in the strongest possible terms.
Of course, that's like the really old, archaic, disgusting view of like, we can change you back from being gay or something, right? Like,
yeah,
and use a doctor to.
Yeah, and they would use aversion techniques and things like that. Okay. And we know that that happened in the past. It doesn't happen anymore. And there are laws here in Australia that mean that you can't, like, that is technically assault, and it's torture.
Sure.
But what they've done with this legislation is they've sold it to the general public on that basis. But what they've also put sexual orientation as a protected characteristic, but they've changed the definition. It's not same-sex orientation. It's not LGB. It is it's an attraction to or an emotional affiliation with a person of the same gender, a different gender, or any other genders. So what does that mean? We don't define gender in our legislation.
Well, that would be the spectrum of a performance, right? Of who you want to express yourself, and you can obviously be attracted to anyone who doesn't identify either one. They're performing their own way.
That also covers heteros.
Yeah.
It covers everybody. It covers anyone having an attraction to anyone else for any reason.
All right, and what are these suppression practices? Like, what does that mean exactly? Because conversion therapy is like you laid out the kind of archaic, abhorrent practice from the past, and suppression practices, what would that mean? What would that cover?
Well, we don't really know, because the way they defined it in the legislation is a suppression practice is a practice that is suppressive.
Okay.
Quote unquote, that's how they defined it. So,
is there examples? Have you come across any examples? What that might mean?
They were trying to debate it in the Legislative Council, and they basically came to the conclusion that, we're going to we're going to push through this legislation, we're going to pass it, and we're going to figure all of that out later.
So I'd imagine it would be like you mentioned that example of the Baths excluding trans women from.
Well, that's not really a suppressive.
Surely that's got to come under you suppressing their right to
express themselves.
Yeah, as a trans woman.
I guess so. Yeah, you could say to the McIver Volunteer Association, you're failing to affirm and support these people in their identity. So conceivably,
yes, yeah. Okay, so also like there's because just thinking, right? I want to know about more spaces for women that are generally or historically have been protected since those laws. Obviously, it's more than just a baths place, I want to know. So you've got like something like a public bath area. You've got like sports.
Yes.
So you're obviously going to have to compete with a trans woman if you're a woman at the moment. Is that right, under those laws?
Yeah, so they pushed through. So the AHRC and Sport Australia announced guidelines in June 2013 that said that people have to be included in sports on the basis of their gender identity. And
that's self-ID, yeah?
Yeah, that's self-ID. So you could rock up to your local ladies netball team and say, I identify as, so I have to be able to play. Now, the problem with what they did is that there's an exemption in Sex Discrimination Act, Section 42. Also in New South Wales, they've got Section 38P, where we can, federally, we can exclude someone on the basis of their sex if strength, stamina and physique are relevant. So
what year was that?
So, gender identity was included in 2013.
Okay.
And that provision, when you look back through the parliamentary papers, the Attorney General at the time said that the purpose of this is to acknowledge the biological differences between men and women.
Sure.
So that was put there for this purpose.
Sure.
So they've completely ignored that protection in the policy. I think they briefly mention it, but they just dismiss it.
Right. So the other law protecting trans identity to compete wherever they choose is higher. All right. So there's public spaces like baths, whatnot. There's sports. That's obviously a contentious one. I know a lot of people that would have a different view on this and want to maybe come to terms some way, maybe more of a case-by-case scenario, or accepted when, like, for example, if you have, I know there's been a case of like physical combat like sport, right? But if the woman who's competing against the trans woman is fine with it, I mean, you know what I mean?
By consent. Well,
by consent. You know what I mean? I think like maybe there's a little bit more. I'm just riffing, by the way.
Okay.
Something by consent, like in.
Well, the problem with that is that women are generally conditioned to be nice and inclusive. So we're kind of at that point. So she might not want to say no. We also know that women who do speak out against this get silenced and get excluded. And the way that the sports policy has been set up, that was released by the AHRC, says that the sports organisation is not to disclose this person's trans or gender identity.
Okay.
If anybody raises an objection, that competitor will be excluded. So say I've just sent my 13-year-old daughter off for netball camp.
Sure.
There is a 15-year-old male on her team and they're allowed to share overnight accommodation. I say, hang on a second, I'm not okay with this.
Sure.
It'll be my daughter who gets excluded.
All right. Okay. So anything, if you didn't give a consent, basically if you don't allow it, it's a suppressive practice that could be flagged for penalising. All right. So I'm just trying to get this in my head. Right? You've got sports, and now you've mentioned parental power, I guess, or guardianship, however you want to look at that. What are some more spaces?
Prisons.
Okay, so prison. This is bizarre to me. Like, what would happen?
When someone goes into intake in prison, there is a group, single-sex prisons in Western Australia, who are fighting against this specifically. We don't have any groups really set up on the eastern seaboard yet.
Sure.
But you just tell them what your gender identity is and you get put in that prison of your choice.
Right. So, okay. So there are trans women in female prisons?
Yes, in Australia, yes.
In Australia, okay.
Yes. Two spring to mind, and it hasn't worked out well. They have assaulted women.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So that seems like something that needs to be addressed, even by the activists that are pushing whatever, like this thriving of or liberation of trans people in our society, which we're all improving. Everyone needs to make more amendments and improvements, but that seems like a little oversight.
They don't
a clear-cut one, right?
They think that gender identity, the right to that person's gender identity, overrides the right of incarcerated women to be safe.
Yeah. Okay. So prison would be one thing. Well, I mean, like any convicted felon could literally just ID as a woman and go straight.
Yep, and that's happened in other, like here we've got Evie Amati, who's the 7-Eleven axe attacker. So he was, a lesbian rejected him romantically. He went on a bender and he thought it was appropriate to take an axe and go and hit perfect strangers in the head. He was convicted of that and he was sent to a women's prison. And when he appealed his sentence, it said in there that he'd assaulted women in the prison.
Was he already a trans woman before?
Yeah, he'd had the full surgery.
Okay, right.
But he's now wanting to transition back to being male, apparently, but he's still in the women's prison. There was also another sex predator who, up in Queensland, who was put into the women's prisons up there. And in other countries, they've put some really unpleasant, extremely violent men, Sweden, the UK, Ireland, into the prison with the women. And some of these men have like chopped up their girlfriends and raped babies, and they're putting them in the women's prison.
Right, okay, that's extreme cases. So there's clearly I mean, if there's a way to exploit something, humans, and especially a manipulative, insidious human's going to go and do it. So there's a loophole there's no way to like validate their claim of that. It's just all up to self-identification. So in those cases, you could, I mean, it's hard, but you'd have to, you'd be, if you're a betting person, you'd be like, that man who did a crime that's now identifying as a trans woman, he's causing trouble in the women's. Okay, so what about, so that's prison, so bathrooms in general, things like that. What about like in school, like, because you touched on the part about parents. I want to get to that in a second. But what happens with schools and education?
So say I'm aware in New South Wales there is a guideline policy called Bulletin 55. And this is to do with transgender students in New South Wales schools.
Is that an education policy?
Department of Education. Freely available. Sure. Google it. And it basically talks about what happens when a child declares a gender or trans identity at school. Now, the way that it's written, it basically says that child has to be validated in that feeling. Everyone has to go along with it. If any child raises an objection, they need to go to student services, and that this child is allowed to compete in the sports, access the toilets, change rooms and dormitories that align with their gender identity. So this child's needs takes precedence over the rest of the student body. So if you've got a boy, 18-year-old boy who declares a gender identity and suddenly he's allowed in the toilets with little 12-year-olds who are trying to deal with menstruation, that's okay now. Dormitories,
Okay, so it's
overnight
the
accommodation.
same situation where a naughty adolescent or young kid, there's no way to separate them from true trans person that's in the middle of their transition. There's no way to separate that. There's no way to identify if someone's being naughty or mean, like a criminal, or just being whatever they're doing, mischievous, or, okay.
So, like, there's no test, there's no genetic test. It's all just based on what they say. And the worst part, I think, about this Bulletin 55 is that when the child's declared that trans identity and the parents are not going along with it, the school is allowed to become involved. Okay. They're allowed to keep it from the parents, and they're actually encouraged to report the parents to the authorities for harming their child.
Wow, that's...
It's extreme, but that's what it says.
You see, well, look, that alone is enough of a reason why I'm so appreciative you come in to explain this, because I know a lot of parents. Like, I'm 38. Most of my mates have got little kids. Well, I don't, but it's I know that alone is seems like it's impinging on the rights of a parent or your guardianship. So if you do not, so does it have an age limit for a child? So how old can they be before they decide?
They could be 5.
And in the law, they've deemed them as an informed person to make a decision upon sex change.
Gender identity, yes, we have to believe the child.
Because the parents has the control of power over the child for everything, but that seems like. Yeah,
the state can become involved, and we do know that there has been a child taken away from their parents, a young girl, because they refused to put her on testosterone instead of getting therapy.
Right.
Yeah.
So look, that alone is enough for, I think, is there an Australian-wide parents association or something, some sort of body of...
There's a support group called Australian Parents Questioning Gender on Facebook. And
I mean also just broadly in general, is there just a parents association that kind of
stick up
for legislation or rights for parents in Australia or something like
that? We're not as organised as some of the other jurisdictions, because this has all happened very rapidly. Okay. And some of the stories within that group are horrifying. Mostly otherwise very caring parents who try their best for their children, but their children go online. They have a bit of distress about something. They might be having same-sex attraction feelings. They might be being bullied. And the way that it's structured online is that if you have this normal feelings about puberty, feeling strange in your own body, the solution is that you're trans. So the kids are going online. They're coming out with this idea that they're trans. They come out and tell their parents. And if their parents don't affirm and support them, now with this Victorian legislation, then the children are coached online what to say, and it's causing all sorts of problems within families. Families are being torn apart by this. Parents seeing daughters who've maybe suffered sexual abuse, sexual trauma, and their response is to think that they're a boy because they think if they're a boy, they won't be a target. And then the child's demanding to have their breasts removed at the age of 15, which has happened in Australia, to go on testosterone. And the parents are thinking, you're just an adolescent. You don't know what you want. Maybe you just need some therapy. But if you don't send them to the gender clinic, now, in the state of Victoria, you don't affirm and support this identity your child has come up with, you will now be in contravention of the legislation.
All right. So then, so that alone is very, I'd imagine, alarming. Parents in general are so protective of their children. Yeah. You are responsible for them, and obviously you love them, and to have the government step in, hire mummy and daddy to the child is quite alarming, I guess.
It's terrifying.
So, I mean, it's an interesting... This is why I'm happy you're here to talk, because I love to hear more of both sides and get more discussion going on this, because it's interesting where you may have successful cases of trans people that have known they were transitioning from 5 or something, and they've made a successful transition, and they're thriving and they're quite popular. And I've seen a few people online that are kind of mini trans celebrities, and they're cool people, right? And then you get, obviously there's a section of people that would be confused or be that might need guidance from their parents or
Yep.
therapy if necessary, if it's some traumatic experience they're going
Yeah.
through, whatever it could be, the whole ocean of mental health that could
Yeah.
need to be addressed. There seems like if they're going to switch to trans as a solution, and then
Yeah.
there's no way for a parent to help make the guidance or
Yeah.
add to their decision. It's just what
Yeah.
they're coming up with externally. So the school, let me just clarify this, the school is not bound or not, they don't need to tell the parent
Yeah.
if they're transitioning the child.
Yeah, and this has happened in other jurisdictions around the world as well, where I think they just defeated this type of policy in like the state of Wisconsin, where the family were not informed that their child was coming to school adopting opposite sex pronouns, names, clothing. The parents were in the dark.
I
Like-
see, I don't mean to laugh at any of this, because, by the way.
It's so outrageous.
Yeah, no, look, I hear you, but every parent that I know would be like pretty damn well aware of what their child, especially with such a younger age, is not in the most complex ways, but in general about if they're going to school and acting like a boy, if they're a biological girl or whatever you call that. So, I mean, like, they'd have to go dressed for one.
Yes.
But I guess when they get there, they can ID another way, and the school affirms that, and the entire class is told to like affirm it and whatnot.
Yeah. So the other children are told to go along with it as well. So they're being captured into it. So girls then having to endure boys in the toilets. I mean, their boundaries are being transgressed. They're being told that, you know, we teach little girls and little boys, if there's someone in the toilet that shouldn't be there, you know, you have a funny feeling in your tummy because there's, you know, someone in a space they're not supposed to be in. We teach them all about stranger danger and all about boundaries and consent. But for some reason, this is all thrown out the window. So the girls who are sitting there in the toilets dealing with their menstruation and things like that, and there's suddenly a boy come in, they're told, no, your boundaries in this instance don't count. That boy, if he says he's a girl, is allowed to be here. And they have to put up with that. And we know that in the UK, where they've made a lot of the toilets mixed sex now, there are numbers of girls who are not going to school, who are not eating and drinking at school and ending up with infections and fainting and so on, because they're trying to avoid going to the toilets. And even the boys aren't happy about it. They don't want girls around when they're trying to go to the toilet. Like, in adolescence, we need a bit of privacy from the other sex. And so it's not working.
Right, yeah. It sounds bizarre that a school would not be bound to tell the parent. I mean, like, they tell the parent any other concern with their academic progress and whatever else they might be concerned with, that they're bound as a duty of care. But when it comes to something like that,
it goes out the window.
Well, it's funny, the rights of parents might be in question because they potentially may not affirm.
Yes.
Because, I mean, how would they know not to tell the parent? Like, the child must be one saying, I'm not sure about telling my parents or something.
Yeah, because what they say online, because what's being told to them online, you know, if your parents don't agree with you, they're transphobic bigots, and you need to tell them to go to the gender clinic. There's now evidence of this. So there's a really important case that was decided last year called the Keira Bell v. Tavistock case. UK High Court, 3 very experienced judges. The outcome of that is that the Children Gender Clinic are now not providing medical interventions to children under the age of 18.
So what happened with Keira Bell?
So Keira was a young woman. She had a lot of problems in her life. She has now realised that she's a lesbian. She was having problems at home. She went online. She thought that all her discomfort with herself and all her problems were because she was trans. That's the other thing. They glom onto this idea of trans and all their other problems are pushed to the side. It's as if they don't matter. So they go to the gender clinics and it's like...
At what age did Keira...
She was about 15.
Okay.
But there are reports of children being taken to these clinics at the age of 3. So, yeah.
Interesting. And so she went at 15.
15.
And what did she get done?
After 3 sessions, they put her on puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and then at 20, I believe it was 20, she had her breast removed. Now, she enters her about a year later. Like, we understand with cognitive development that it doesn't really complete until about the age of 25.
Sure.
So children just don't, that's why so many teenagers and young adults make stupid decisions. And
100%.
You know, and they don't understand the long-term consequences. So at 21, she'd realised she made a mistake. All her problems that she had at 15 were still there, still unresolved. and she realised that she was probably a lesbian, and she realised that what had been done to her was she actually hadn't consented. She was 15.
Right.
And they didn't do a proper mental health assessment. They just handed her the medication. And now she regrets it. So there's a whole cohort of young people who refer to themselves as desisters and detransitioners who've been pushed onto this medicalised pathway, and they've come to realise it was a mistake. But
Wow.
She's infertile. It's irreversible.
Okay, so did she take someone to court for this, or what?
So she went to the UK High Court to have a judicial review of the Tavistock policies in relation to consent.
Sure.
So she was arguing that children cannot consent to this treatment because it is life-changing, it is irreversible, it is really dramatic, extreme surgery.
Sure.
Little boys are, to literally have your penis and testicles cut off, castration, I mean, that's extreme surgery. So there are children going to these clinics. When you put on the puberty blockers, we are told that they are reversible. They are not reversible. It interrupts your puberty. Your peers progress, but these children do not. They stay in this suspended childhood. So we know that children who are put on puberty blockers inevitably proceed to, I think it's 98%, proceed to cross-sex hormones. That makes them infertile. The side effects of this are legion. It impacts their cognitive development. They drop IQ points. It stunts their growth. Some girls have nearly died. Some girls have had fits, ended up with acquired brain injuries and brain damage. Their rate of stroke, MS, heart attack elevates astronomically. For girls, their internal reproductive organs atrophy, and it's excruciatingly painful. They cannot have normal sex. They cannot have orgasms. So they have all their uterus removed. So that leads to osteoporosis, Alzheimer's, prolapses. This is extreme solutions for kids having problems with their gender.
All sorts, yes, okay. So there seems like there's a progression of self-ID, then you can get puberty blockers, and then cross-sex hormones, and then gender
surgery.
So what age would, or have you come across or found out that you can actually access puberty blockers?
We've heard of kids as young as 10.
Okay. Here in Australia, or is that the cases overseas? Or?
Yeah, we have. Senator Greg Donnelly in the New South Wales Upper House put in freedom of information requests to all the gender clinics.
Sure.
A woman by the name of Professor Diana Kenny, she assesses all the data, and she's done some really good research around this. You can look both of them up, and have got the numbers on the gender clinics around Australia. So there are thousands of Australian children who are currently on this medical pathway.
Of like puberty blockers and whatnot.
Yeah, and cross-sex hormones.
Do you know how young that gets to?
Oh, I'm trying to just picture it. I think they are really, I know that there are children as young as 3 who've gone to the gender clinics.
Right.
But in terms of putting them on the medication, I think it's like when they start going through puberty. So, I mean, we know that it starts as young as 8 these days. So, look, I don't want to say because I don't want to be incorrect, but that data is available on Diana Kenny's website. And look, we do, the week the decision for Tavistock came out, so they decided that children under the age of 16 cannot consent to this treatment. Children between the age of 16 and 18, it is highly unlikely, and you need to get court approval, but it's highly unlikely it would be granted. So the gender clinics in the UK have stopped offering this sort of treatment to children.
When did they stop?
So this would have been in December.
Right, and that was because of the Keira Bell case.
Because of Keira Bell. But here in Australia, the ABC, the SBS have not reported on this case. This case made headlines around the world.
Of course.
I think the Sydney Morning Herald reported on it about a week later. I'm not sure about the other media outlets.
Well, look, here I am learning directly from you, Katherine. And I'm super interested in what's going on, how we should go about ourselves. Let's all make some amendments, improvements in every way. We've been evolving, trying to get more and more people to thrive, becoming more understanding for all sorts of minority groups. And I'm learning from you what's happening in laws here, but I'm sure there's a lot of parents that don't know that, anything like that. So it's interesting because I've been listening to a wide variety of opinion online, right? And so I guess the the fear of suicide rates and things like that would be what's driving. I mean, the activists are doing something for a reason, right? We need to let trans people be themselves and thrive and not be feeling excluded. All those typical kind of tropes you might throw on a minority group, but specific to them, all sorts of not feeling included of the group and of the whole of society, or being able to be accepted with their identity and thrive. So I'm thinking, what happens when you don't accept them, and you deny the identity? It descends in mental health, or that whole range of what could go wrong there, into like ultimately suicide. So that's where I think I mentioned quickly before, there seems to be a big lack of suicide investigation, or a government body or community bodies that can really reach out, and not only trans, but I'll stick to there for now, but for all of us, we all know like how big suicide is, and I'm sure you care about these such matters as well. Like any Australian, I mean, any human would get behind, let's increase suicide prevention, or a program, or groups that could work with communities individually or whatnot. So for me, it feels like there's a lack of, say, the mainstream media reporting on such things, so we can't. I mean, I don't understand how things can actually go under the radar. Even if you are in the camp of activists trying to push these laws through, you want everyone to understand the laws, right? Because it's governing everybody. It can't be just slid in from the side. So I don't understand why there's no media scrutiny and community discussion about laws that will govern how you can parent and things of such, because the more people understand, the better. That's how I see it, right?
Well, I think the reason, they do push the very pro-trans narrative. There's been a lot of coverage in the ABC and SBS of young people who've transitioned or non-binary, all very glowing and brave and stunning and all the rest of it. But they don't want to have media scrutiny. There's a document that's been put out by the international law firm Dentons to help people who are in the LGBTIQ+ community push their policies that they want. And some of the strategies say that to avoid media scrutiny, to piggyback on the back of more popular policies, like with same-sex marriage in Ireland, they piggybacked gender identity, sex self-ID on the back of that legislation. And they don't want media scrutiny because they know that it often falls over when you shine a light on it. Like, for instance, with the suicide rates, like with the children being transitioned, one thing that they found in the Tavistock decision was that there was no data, no follow-up, no research to determine the efficacy of this intervention long term. And now, as we're seeing, because this is all new, this is only, in the last 5 years, the rates of kids going to gender clinics in Australia has up like 4,000 or 5,000%. So these kids aren't at that age of the early 20s where they go, I've made a mistake. We can expect to see a lot more of that happening. But they don't want scrutiny. They just want this all pushed through because there is no research or data to back up what they're saying. I mean, we know, say for instance, Sweden, which is one of the most equitable nations on the face of the earth, very inclusive. They were one of the first countries on board with the gender transitioning clinics. They have now absolutely stepped back from that. They did a longitudinal study of every single person who transitioned in Sweden over 10 years. And they found that the suicide rate was nearly 20 times higher than the rest of the population. And these are people who've been transitioned in the most inclusive country in the world. So, and there's not, you cannot all just say, oh, well, it's because they weren't included or they weren't affirmed. I don't know if that really stands up in a country like Sweden. But it's like to go down this path of changing your body to emulate the opposite sex, and obviously it doesn't make you the opposite sex. So maybe, there are now male transitioners in America. I think Walt Hyatt and Jamie Shull, who were very high-profile transitioners back in the day, and they, after years of transition, they realised that yes, I'm not the opposite sex. I'm not, and nothing is ever going to make me the opposite sex. And they've undergone all this really grim surgery. The medication is really hard on your body, particularly if you're taking it for decades. We know, and they get to the point where they're like, this is too much of a toll. And most of them, their marriages break down, their families break down, they lose their jobs. it's a huge price to pay.
Yes, okay.
So there's not evidence. Like, I know that there are a few successful people in life, like maybe Kate McGregor or Carlotta, who have transitioned. They transitioned as adults. It was something they really wanted. But transitioning all these very vulnerable children, and that's one thing the Tavistock said, was some of these children presenting are some of the, quote unquote, the most disturbed children we've ever seen. And this is a mass unregulated experiment on children. So we don't know how all of this is going to play out in 10 years.
True. Well, look, I can see your passion and I share it, and I know every parent that I personally know would be very alarmed to know there isn't enough maybe protections to stop predators or children who are not feeling themselves to do the wrong thing in that, go down that path. So it seems like this bizarre battle that's of, we want trans people to thrive. However, there seems to be a group of trans people that say they are, that do it wrong, or they're predators, or they're not.
Yeah.
But we're not talking about that, and I think that needs to be, there needs to be some strategy to identify that, because if, like, you would imagine, if you were a trans person, you wouldn't want to advocate or let predators slip in, or see children do the wrong thing. You know, you wouldn't want that anyhow. No one would, right? So that sounds very interesting. So all the laws are going to support trans people in education, affirming, and then child services called on parents. So that's a big one. That's a really...
Taking the children away. And as I've said, all these policies are happening by stealth. And there's not this conversation. I mean, I understand that, say, Kate McGregor, I think Carlotta, there are a number of mature-aged people with a trans identity who say children should not be being transitioned, who do not agree with children being transitioned either, because they understand the toll it takes on your body. So,
of course. So for your, in your view, you'd think adult trans as you will, but children, no. I guess that's what's been changing over the years, right? It's been lowering the services. Yeah, I hear this this term like medical gatekeeping, like popping up within trans, and it's kind of where we're getting at lowering the age to children, and at what age is a child an informed human to make such a decision, and what power does the parent have? Zero or some? Can they help guide? Are they, you can't ask a 15-year-old, are you prepared to give up your fertility? You know, I mean, I didn't decide to have children until I was well into my 30s. Before that, I was like, oh, kids, revolting. Who wants to do that? So asking a 15-year-old to commit to a medical intervention that's going to take that away from them is really extreme. Yeah. Okay. And so I'm just thinking also like from... like, the trans activist or a trans person side of things, where they want to be allowed to thrive, but it just doesn't seem like the laws are actually supporting everything for them, but then there's maybe some... collateral damage, call it. Yeah, it is, And medical gatekeeping, it's such a loaded term, but it's like, it's there for a reason. You know, for a woman who wants to get a hysterectomy, or to have her tubes tied, for instance, we hear this story all the time. Women who families are complete, they don't want to have any more kids, they ask to have their tubes tied. It's almost impossible. But these kids who are 15 are being allowed to have this medical intervention that's going to make them sterile. Right. And so, I guess... You're happy. Your view would be like to advocate trans adults. That's fine. As an adult, as you please. You have no prejudice against them in yours. No, knock yourself out. And whatever spaces they choose to use. Oh, I still have reservations around that. I think that there still needs... I think the UK actually has a really good system. Yeah, what's up with them? So they have their Equality Act, and... if you're a person who declares a trans identity, you have to go through a process to get what they call a gender recognition certificate. And then you can be treated for pretty much all intents and purposes as the opposite sex in law and provision of services. Okay. There's some gatekeeping, as they say, but it's reasonable. It's like you have to live as the opposite sex for 2 years. You have to go in front of a panel. You have to pay a very nominal fee. But you have to prove that you're committed to this path. It's quite a big ask to be allowed to have protections for a group from which you're excluded on the basis of something objective, to suddenly ask to be part of that group. What is that act or that law called?
So that would be, I think it's the Gender Recognition Act.
Okay.
So, but even if you have a GRC, you're not allowed to access certain areas. So there are still areas like domestic violence shelters, rape crisis centres, where males could be excluded on the basis of their sex. But most of the time they're allowed in. But there still needs to be single sex provision in certain areas, irrespective of what people's identity are.
Okay, and I'd imagine the trans people, community activists might obviously want that abolished.
Yeah, they're not
All
happy
of it,
about
like,
that.
yeah.
Yeah. And unfortunately, there are people who will use it for nefarious purposes, or who use it because they think that their right to be validated is more important. And I just don't think the women should have to bear that burden. You know, and I mean, there are facilities where they are happy to, like say in Vancouver, there is one rape crisis centre that's been there from the 70s. There's a dozen in the area. There was one that wanted to remain women only. Sure. And they have been sued. They've had their funding stripped from them. They've had rats nailed to the door. They've had dead rodents shoved through the letterbox. They've had "Kill T.E.R.F. graffiti put on the building. And this is like a service that offers support to the most disenfranchised, traumatised women in our society. Like trans-identified women could go to the other 11 rape crisis centres.
Sure.
But you can't just leave this one alone.
All right, because that existence of that building is suppressing their right to have their identity. All right, so that's interesting though, that T.E.R.F. term, that's the trans exclusionary radical feminist, right?
Yeah, that's a loaded term.
Well, it's very bizarre. So anyone, for example, I guess that's under the umbrella of feminism, but you would have the intersectional feminists that include trans and everybody.
Yeah.
Feminism
is for everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, but the trans exclusionary feminist would be someone like yourself that sees a clear definition for safe spaces for women.
But I'm not trans exclusionary technically, because I wouldn't exclude trans men because they are biologically female. So they're still included in the women's spaces. But so the word T.E.R.F. was coined by a feminist back in the day.
Yeah.
But it's evolved from that. It really has evolved, and it is a slur. It has been declared a slur by Justice Julian Knowles in the UK High Court in the Fair Cop decision. He has said that it's a word used as a thought terminator to dismiss anything that this person says. And if you go online and look up, say, "Kill T.E.R.F.s," it is a slur that is used against women like me, and it's often used in conjunction with extremely violent, vicious disembodiment, rape, threats, etc.
Well, it's quite vicious.
It is. Well,
that would be anyone, like even some parents that would decide that they were against their young child taking like puberty blockers or something. That would put them in the camp of a T.E.R.F.
They'd be a T.E.R.F. J.K. Rowling is a T.E.R.F. She's queen of the T.E.R.F.s. Yeah.
Interesting, because it's radical feminism, not exactly a radical idea to like believe in like protection for your child or want power or guidance over your child in that regard. So it's an interesting way to throw it. But
yeah, I know women who would like to talk about women's rights and issues that affect them and impact them.
That's radical now.
That's radical. That will get you, in some quarters, it will get you fired. In Malta, I heard that in the country of Malta, because this is happening all around the world to certain degrees.
Sure.
In Malta, women are now being beaten in the street for holding views like mine. They're being assaulted by trans rights activists.
Okay, they're having some like brutal protesting.
Yeah, they're known. There are women who have been like targeted and attacked. There are women. So there's a Scottish politician by the name of Joanna Cherry who stood up for women in the Scottish Parliament. So yes, she would be a T.E.R.F. She has had death threats made against her that have been so extreme the police have put her into police protection.
Interesting. Well, see, that's one thing that doesn't like I see there's a war of ideas. That's what I want this podcast about, to actually hear all the sides, and I'm hoping to get in touch with an activist or hear some activist bodies talk about what is driving and where they want to be, what the liberation of trans people looks like in 2021 and what we're going to do about it and how to get there smoothly as possible without such ridiculous things. So I'm interested in like all these ideas on it.
Yeah, but they are, like, they have the protections under the law. They have the gender identity protection at a federal level. They have the protection here in New South Wales that was enacted in 1996. What they're asking for is women's rights for themselves. And unfortunately, there are women pushing back and saying no, and they're just not happy about it. And this debate has also, unfortunately, unleashed a whole lot of latent misogyny that has been in existence.
Give me an example.
So you've got all these sort of left progressive young men, you know, the woke beards, the hipsters with their beards, and they've seen that women like me are now the disobedient women. So TERF is like a new way of saying like slut, witch, you know, you can imagine.
Yeah.
So this is now giving them license to be really revolting towards women.
You see, that's where I don't get, like, even if, like, for example, you're a trans person and you're heading up a trans activist body, a group that engages with government bodies or legislative bodies, how could you, like, you couldn't stand behind more violence and abuse and threats to people that are obviously don't have the views like you. So wouldn't you want to be wouldn't you want to be chatting to people more about it and trying to get everyone to understand the laws that you might actually want? That's what I'm thinking. Like the big media houses have completely failed. Like I'm sure there's voices to be heard about this.
Yeah.
So if there's laws to be put in place that are being debated, that we can understand them better, not just have them lumped on us when it is a bit in the dark, so to speak.
Well, whenever women have gathered to talk about this, it happened to us at Sydney Uni, we've had violent protests. It's happened in Canada. It happened at a library. A bunch of women wanted to get together at the library and have a panel, and the violent protest was so bad the police had to be called and women had to be escorted in by the police.
When was that?
Oh, so that was last year at not Vancouver. Was it the Seattle Public Library? Megan Murphy of Feminist Current was talking. You can look up, you can see the footage. There are all these sort of small women trying to get into the library, and there's these big buff heads literally shoulder charging these women. There was a group of women who spoke in, I think it was Sussex in the UK. It was a Labour convention, and then the women who have ideas like me, who came under the umbrella of the group Women's Place UK, decided to get together to talk. And the trans rights activists surrounded the building and they pounded on the windows with hammers and chanted threats, and the police were literally standing there with their hands in their pockets, just staring around like, you know, nothing to see here. The disobedient women need to be shut up. We need to shut them up.
Yeah, I don't understand that.
No.
Complete violent and forceful manner to think as you do. Like, there's one way to educate people, and it's to talk.
I know.
I mean, if like we're all evolving since the internet pretty fast, like rapidly, and just needs more discussion. So that's why, I'm happy you're in here explaining all this to a lot of people who are unawares of maybe call it the fight behind the scenes. And I hope there's like better strategies from both parties to come together and connect for protect parents, protect someone in sports, or have a more. I'm not a genius on these matters, but increase suicide awareness and provisions, community resources for all people, trans people especially, maybe.
But there is this this overt censorship of any criticism of gender identity ideology.
Yeah, it's just bizarre because it's painted as transphobic and
bigoted, and there's no, like, I would look at it as you have this ideology that's sort of come into play, and we're not allowed to debate it. We've invited other people from the other side to come and talk to us on various podcasts. There have been panels that have been set up, and when people hear that, a T.E.R.F.s on there, they withdraw, or the trans rights activists get the T.E.R.F. booted off. So we're not able to have these, candid, open discussions where maybe we could come to some sort of a compromise, or maybe one side's ideas are defeated because they don't have merit, whether it's my side or the other side. Like yesterday they had the suppression legislation being debated in the Legislative Council in Victoria, and watched hours of it. A number of women did. You had to drop in and out because it was just so intense. But the people who were for the trans rights, who wanted the legislation pushed in, compared to the people who were just saying, look, we're not against outlawing conversion and suppression practices. No one is. Like, no one is. But what we've done with this legislation is that it's really broad-ranging. There hasn't been a proper community consultation. It's structured in a very unusual statutory way. The words that you use are really weird for legislation. Maybe we need to just dial it back and have a more broad-ranging consultation. Let's think about this. There are people, the AMA criticised it, the Victorian Law Society, religious groups, feminists, lesbians, were all criticising it and saying there are problems. Can we talk about this? But the ones who wanted to push it through, when they were talking, it was very much rooted in emotion and hyperbole and hurt feelings and shame and all very emotive, but not, and the suicide statistics. If you don't affirm and support people who are gay and lesbian or trans, they will kill themselves. So all very emotional. And then on the other side, you just had people saying there are problems with this legislation. It's not just impacting, like, we can't just look at it from the perspective of protecting this group of people, which, yes, we all agree we should do. But the way you're going about it is that other people are going to be really impacted. Parents, teachers, children who now declare a gender identity in Victoria are going to have to go to the gender clinics, and then they're led onto this medicalised pathway. If they go and get therapy and the doctor doesn't do that, they might be liable for contravening the legislation. And the penalties are extreme. Of course. 10 years incarceration and $200,000 in fines.
Right, so look, that's
so it's just like there's all this hyperbole and emotion on the other side, and it's just turned, and a lot of threats coming from the trans rights activists, and you've got these women and lawyers and doctors sitting here going, hang on a second, like, let's talk about this. So it's a very distorted argument.
Right, it sounds like it's not clear at all, and it's very hard to get your head around. And look, I'm sure there's people that will listen to this and be like, wow, had no idea about none of this. So it sounds like the strategies are the issue, right? So, I mean, as you mentioned, you want to see trans people protected, but without, obviously, I'm just going to use that phrase, collateral damage of children making the wrong decision.
Women's spaces.
Women's spaces, or them in sports. So it's
so there's this conflict of rights here, and when a new group, because it is new, these demands are new. They weren't here 20 years ago. You know, I grew up in an era, there weren't trans kids at school. There were gay and lesbian kids, but this whole trans idea of the trans child is a very relatively new construct. And we're being told, these people demanding these rights, we have to acquiesce, there's going to be no debate, and this is how it is. But in every other human rights movement in the history of human rights, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, there have been decades of conversations and fighting to gain the legislative protections that we have. But trans has come in the last 10 years, and they have, there's nothing been seen like this in modern law.
That's incredible. So it's dwarfing all other movements in pace or acquisition. So, okay, well then this is why I feel like this talk, it can be so valuable. You can attract more people talking about it. You can gain a lot more intellectuals, professionals to weigh in and start to create better strategies that, someone like the random person can't come up with, and have more discussions to actually shake hands and let everybody thrive without there being too much, collateral damage on the side of the movement.
And like with the critical side, I mean, we're up against it. So our women's group, so I co-founded Save Women's Sports Australasia back in October in response to guidelines that were being released by sports associations in Australia that supported the trans and gender inclusion guidelines. Of course. And, we don't have funding. It's all women like me. We've got kids and study and whatever. We're all doing this late at night. We have politicians, doctors, psychologists, social workers. We have people from across the board. We have people from all religions or political parties. But the LGBTIQ plus movement is now globally worth over $4 trillion.
Yeah, right.
A few years ago it was only a few billion.
Okay.
It's exploded. So when they say we're so vulnerable, we're oppressed, no one listens to us, it's like, that is just not the case anymore. You know, we now have LGBTIQ inclusion policies in every global bank, multinational corporation, government department, you know, pretty much across the Western world. So this is not a movement of oppressed people. They have huge resources, and they are dictating policy. So say, for instance, in New South Wales now, there's actually a parliamentary inquiry. I really encourage people to go and have a look and make a submission as a parent or interested citizen. Like, they're trying to push gender identity ideology into schools as part of the curriculum. So they'll be
what would that mean? Like,
so they teach children about transgenderism. They'll be teaching our children that sex is a social construct and it's a spectrum, and that boys can have periods and girls can have penises. And they want this incorporated into the curriculum for our children. Now, I'm not okay with this. This is a belief system.
mm-hmm.
And I don't think that it's appropriate for primary age school children to be taught this, because we also know that when children come into contact with this ideology, there's often clusters of children who suddenly come out as trans because they're impressionable and they're suggestible.
Sure.
And for a child to be told, you know, I mean, two of my daughters are very gender non-conforming. One in particular, you know, she gets around in her work boots and shorts and she has an undercut. And she's told me that she wanted to be a boy. And I'm like, if I was a woke mother, I probably would have dragged her off to the gender clinic. But instead I say, why? And she said, well, I don't want to have children. And I'm not sure I want to get married. I'm like, that's fine, darling. You can, like, whatever.
Yeah.
You know, that doesn't mean you're a boy. But if she was in a school where she'd been taught this gender ideology and she comes home and says, no, Mum, I really am a boy because I want to play footy and I don't like dresses and I don't affirm and support now, you know, and she's telling school, well, Mummy doesn't agree with me. Mummy won't call me Joe instead of my name.
There would be an issue that way.
The school could then all of a sudden start just quietly doing what they're doing without me knowing.
Mm-hmm.
This is where this is all going.
Yeah.
So they want to incorporate gender identity ideology into the schools in New South Wales. Now there's a bill that has the inquiry going on where they're saying that they don't want this taught in schools. So they're going to ban the teaching of gender identity ideology in schools. This does not mean that kids aren't going to get sex education or they aren't going to be taught about maybe same-sex attraction, you know, when it's appropriate in high school. So if anyone is curious about this, I suggest they have a look themselves, read the bill. It's not hard to read, and then put forward their opinion. I mean, there might be people listening who are in support of it, and you know, of course, you're welcome to express your opinion just like everyone else. So.
Well, look, in my mind, I encourage anyone who thinks or supports what you're doing to get in touch. How would they support, for example, what groups you're involved with?
Okay, so there's Save Women's Sports Australasia. We focus specifically on retaining the integrity of girls and women's sports. So we have a website and Facebook page, so you can go and check us out. Agree with us or not agree with us, please get involved in the discussion.
Yeah.
There's Australian Parents Questioning Gender. So for those whose children might have been captured by the ideology who are concerned. There's also the Coalition of Biological Reality, which is a group, it's non-partisan, it's non-religious, it discusses all the issues. So if you plug into some of those groups, there's Victorian Women's Guild in Victoria, there's Fair Go for Queensland Women, there's Women Speak down in Tasmania. So there are a number of groups up and running. There's also some really good resources online. There's Gender HQ, which analyses all the research that's available, and that's very objective. That's really interesting. So in terms of like the suicide statistics and stuff, if you'd really like to get your head around that, there's some really good, they get all the main research and they have it in one spot.
Well, I think you've laid out tons of information. I mean, there's lots going on, and that's a luxury to try to actually get an insight to this stuff, because all those websites, please go and visit whoever's interested. And it just takes a while for people to go in and like look and read and understand those messages from those groups and whatnot, and just see how it's going to affect them and what they feel about it, whatever. Yeah. But this goes a long way to bring like the situation, whatever you feel about it, to light. Yes. And see, that's where my mind is. It's like, I mean, it sounds like a lot of these activists are quite forceful, so this situation doesn't get brought to light. But in my mind, even if you were an activist, you'd want the situation
Yes.
spoken about too. Like, if you truly want to help people and help everybody progress and understand what's up, then it has to be spoken about and thought about and understood. Yeah. So.
Yeah, if you hold an idea and you want that idea to be as robust as possible, you want it debated. You want to debate it to strengthen your idea, to refine it. I mean, maybe there are aspects that are wrong or that people don't agree with you, but we need to be able to debate it openly. And as we discussed prior to turning the cameras on, I mean, this gender identity ideology, it's infiltrating the academy, like in education, and we're all diverse and inclusive and equitable as long as you follow the dominant orthodoxy. So if you're someone that might have a bit more of a conservative view, or you might disagree with something to do with LGB or whatever, you can't say that anymore. Whereas I think we need to air these ideas, and, the bad ideas get shut down because obviously they're shown to have no merit. But I think just allowing an idea that has such massive ramifications for society, like to get rid of what they're trying to do essentially is get rid of the protected characteristic of sex entirely in law, which is ludicrous because women, we have special needs with our bodies, with the reproductive process of our bodies, the historical oppression and discrimination. We know that, say, in terms of, CEOs and earning capacity, we're not there yet. These things need to be able to be discussed. Yeah. And putting gender identity instead of sex obfuscates all of that. So if they're going to do that, and I mean, I don't know, in 50 years they might say, well, you were wrong and gender identity was the right way to go. And if that's what society decides.
Yes.
But everyone needs to be able to have all the information to make that decision rather than just have the whole policy presented as a fait accompli. And you have to go along with it. And if you don't, you're a bigot and you'll get fired.
Yes, I'm with you. Because I spoke to you briefly before, and I get the sense you don't have any prejudice against any of these groups or trans people, apart from opposing the laws being placed in which they may view as. But on a personal sense, you don't have any prejudice against LGBTQI people, like trans people, anyone to thrive, go for it, do your thing. But just like you mentioned, whichever way society goes, I'm all for it. Like, do it, evolve, get better, include, thrive, get people to thrive on all groups across the board, but everyone get involved in what's happening, bring it all to light. So, all right, well, that's probably a good place to finish up on this one.
Okay. Thank you, Christian.
Yeah, look, thank you so much for enlightening me, and I'll share this around with whoever's interested. And I'm actually a little annoyed that, the major mainstream media groups do not report and help discussions like this, or anyone from the activist side to the conservative side to actually understand it better. Yeah, it's bizarre to me that it won't be brought up to light.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know, they have a lot of fear, and people like me were cast as like conservative right wingers. I mean, I voted for every party, in Australia, and I'm not religious. I'm not really a conservative. I agree with some ideas of conservatism, of progressivism. There are people who hold ideas like me who have come from all walks of life. This, we're not
100%, and
we're just asking questions.
Yes, and you're not exactly married to your ideas as well. Like, I've come across some people that might have had call it, just for example, a racist viewpoint on one thing, but they're not. But so if I was an activist minded or just wants to vilify, you'd be like, that person's racist. But I've come across my own experience just to actually ask the person or educate them, actually, do you know it was actually blah, 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 and help them understand something. Like, oh, okay. But then they move on and they don't hold that racist idea anymore, but it's a little component of them. It's not them as a total, whole being. Yeah,
I think we should all be open to being persuaded if the argument's strong enough, Like, that's why we need to have this research that doesn't exist yet, the data. And people need to be able to make up their own minds. And, I always say, well, I can always be persuaded otherwise. Like, tell me your argument.
Okay. Yeah. Well, anyway. Listen, Katherine, thank you very, very much. I appreciate your time and your insights to everything that's happening. By the way, also, this debate that's going on with the legislation. Yeah. That's happening now. When is that supposed to finish?
Okay, so... Well, Victoria passed last night, but the one that's happening here in New South Wales, you've got to the end of February.
Okay,
Yeah.
and this is happening in Parliament in Canberra?
No, this is just in New South
New South
Wales
Wales,
in
okay.
education. There's also some other legislation possibly coming out in Tasmania. So if people are interested, come and have a look at the websites that I mentioned, the groups.
Mm-hmm.
They often provide news updates. You know, the mainstream media won't, but if you want to follow it or you're interested, just come and check us out there.
Perfect. Katherine, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, let's end it there. That was really insightful, and I can't wait to share that to a ton of other people.